The wind had not yet settled from the storm the night before. Gray clouds still hovered low over the ridges of the Wyoming plains, casting long shadows across the wet earth. Emily Harper tightened her oilskin coat against the chill and clicked her tongue, urging her chestnut mare, Penny, forward through the morning mist. The fences always needed checking after a night like that. Wood could splinter, posts could fall, and predators often followed chaos. The ground squelched beneath Penny's hooves as they approached the northern boundary of the ranch. Fallen branches littered the landscape, and the prairie grass looked beaten flat by sheets of rain. Emily scanned the line, dismounting occasionally to check the wire tension and reinforce weak spots with quick, practiced hands. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but her mind had wandered elsewhere, caught up in the familiar rhythm of repair and vigilance. She hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary. That's why it took her a moment to realize what she was seeing. A sudden flicker of movement just beyond the edge of the trail, in the thicket of brambles growing wild near the old cottonwood tree. Penny snorted, her ears twitching nervously. Emily narrowed her eyes, approaching on foot. There, barely visible beneath a tangled mess of branches and mud, lay a foal. It was impossibly small. Legs like reeds, ribs too visible. Its gray coat streaked with blood and grime. Brambles had coiled around its legs like barbed snakes, and its chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. One eye fluttered open as she crouched beside it, wild and glassy, filled with the sheer, instinctive terror of something that had only known suffering. Emily froze, heart hammering. She'd seen wild foals before, but never one this young or this close to death. She reached out, carefully, gently pressing her hand to the foal's neck. It flinched, but there was warmth, a pulse, faint but stubborn. A Mustang, she realized, separated from its herd, maybe during the storm, maybe born too soon. Either way, it had no business surviving this long in the open, especially in its condition. Logic told her to let nature take its course. She couldn't afford this. Not time, not money, not the heartbreak. But emotion spoke louder, pulsing through her chest and echoing in the pit of her stomach. She knew that feeling: abandonment, desperation, the edge of being forgotten. Without another thought, Emily peeled off her gloves, crouched lower, and began pulling the brambles away. It wasn't graceful. The thorns tore at her sleeves, drawing blood on her forearms, but she kept going, mumbling soft reassurances to the foal, even if she knew he couldn't understand. Minutes passed like hours, and finally, the last thorn came free. The foal didn't try to stand. He simply lay there, spent, shaking, waiting. Emily looped her arms under his frail body and stood, staggering slightly under the awkward weight. He was lighter than he looked, which was its own kind of tragedy. Penny neighed as Emily approached with the bundle, her hooves shifting uneasily, but she held steady as Emily tied the foal securely into the saddle blanket across her own mount's back. The ride back was long and slow, and Emily glanced over her shoulder 100 times to make sure the foal was still breathing. Back at the ranch, there was no time for hesitation. She bypassed the barn and carried the foal straight into the house, clearing space in the kitchen and laying down blankets by the wood-burning stove. The old kettle sang on the stove as she warmed milk, adding a bit of honey and electrolytes, praying it would do something. He wouldn't take the bottle at first. Emily had to coax him, trickle by trickle, cradling his head in her lap while whispering whatever came to mind. Stories from her childhood. Half-forgotten lullabies, confessions she'd never spoken aloud. About the fire, about the night her parents didn't come home, about how she inherited this ranch too young, too lost, with more ghosts than cattle in the fields. Outside, the sun was rising higher, but in the kitchen, it felt like time stood still. By late afternoon, the foal, who she'd started calling Spirit, almost without thinking, took a stronger sip from the bottle. Not much, but enough to kindle hope. She spent that night beside him, curled on the floor with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, dozing lightly between feedings. The fire kept the cold at bay, and Spirit's breathing grew less ragged, his limbs twitching in sleep. Emily woke once in the dark, startled by a sudden nudge against her boot. Spirit's head had shifted, resting lightly against her foot, as though drawn by warmth or memory. And in that quiet, breathless moment, Emily Harper felt something shift, not just in the foal, but in herself. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about healing, and neither of them would face it alone. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Emily stirred from her place on the kitchen floor. The fire had burned low, leaving the room bathed in a soft orange glow, the air faintly scented with pine and ash. Spirit lay curled under the thick quilt she'd wrapped around him, his chest rising and falling with more consistency than the night before. It was a small victory, but Emily knew better than to let her guard down. Foals this fragile could change course within hours. She stood slowly, her joints stiff from sleeping on the hardwood, and moved quietly to prepare another bottle. Her movements were practiced but careful. The milk had to be warm, not hot. The ratio had to be right. Everything had to be just right. When she knelt again and pressed the bottle to Spirit's lips, he didn't resist. His mouth moved sluggishly, but he drank, more than before. Emily's heart clenched with cautious hope. The days that followed passed in a blur of routine and worry. Emily converted the corner of her kitchen into a makeshift stall, using hay, old blankets, and sandbags to create a space where Spirit could rest safely. The rest of the ranch faded into the background. Chores were done with one eye on the clock. Fence repairs, cattle checks, feeding the chickens, each task was rushed so she could return to the kitchen and check on Spirit. On the third night, the foal's breathing turned shallow again. His skin felt clammy despite the fire, and he refused the bottle for hours. Emily sat beside him, wiping down his body with warm water and whispering to him through gritted teeth, fighting panic with determination. She didn't sleep that night, didn't dare. Every hour she tried again. A few sips, then nothing, then a few more. By dawn, his color had started to return, but the strain was beginning to show. Her eyes were sunken, her body moving on muscle memory alone. When Clint, her neighbor, arrived that afternoon with the delivery of feed, he barely recognized her. He stood in the doorway, hands on his hips, glancing at the foal with a disapproving shake of his head. "You know that thing's not gonna make it, right?" he muttered. Emily didn't respond. She poured warm water into a basin, continuing her routine like he wasn't there. "It's a wild one," he added. "Even if it lives, it ain't meant for a place like this. You're throwing good time after bad." Still, she said nothing. When he finally left, she closed the door behind him with more force than necessary. She didn't have the energy to argue. She didn't need validation. She needed Spirit to survive. The nights were the worst. The silence in the house was thick with worry. She often found herself speaking to Spirit, not just for him, but to soothe the ache inside her chest. She told him about her father's stubborn streak, her mother's quiet strength. How this ranch had once echoed with laughter and music before fire turned it into a shadow of what it had been. She hadn't told anyone these stories in years. Some nights she cried as she spoke, the sound swallowed by the crackle of the fire. Spirit would stir, sometimes nuzzling toward her, as if sensing her grief. It was a strange, silent bond forming between them, raw, unspoken, and built on survival. As days turned into a week, signs of improvement became clearer. Spirit began to stand on shaky legs, wobbling like a newborn deer, collapsing often, but trying again. Emily stopped everything to watch him, hands pressed over her mouth in amazement. His appetite grew. He started exploring the kitchen, sniffing at drawers and knocking over pots. His presence, once a source of worry, became a strange kind of comfort. Word spread in town. Some folks dropped by to see the miracle foal. Lucas, Emily's younger brother, came by with a bundle of carrots and a bag of vet supplies. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but he showed up again the next day. And the next. Friends brought bandages, vitamins, clean towels, and warm meals. Emily hadn't asked for help, but people offered it anyway. The small acts of kindness reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten. She wasn't as alone as she thought. One afternoon, Spirit managed to chase a ball of yarn across the floor, startling himself when it unraveled. He darted into the corner of the kitchen and then peeked out again, his ears twitching curiously. Emily laughed, a real laugh, the kind that cracked through the exhaustion and reached the hollow places inside her. She realized then that Spirit wasn't the only one healing, but the fight wasn't over. He still limped, favoring his back leg. The wound on his flank reopened every few days, and his energy dipped unpredictably. Emily kept charts on the fridge, tracking his feedings and temperature like a field medic. Even so, something about the way he moved, the spark in his eyes, the stubbornness in his steps, told her he was a survivor. One night, as a cold wind rattled the windows, Emily sat on the floor beside him, her back against the stove. Spirit lay curled beside her, his head resting on her knee. She watched the fire dance, her mind quiet for the first time in weeks. She didn't know what the future would hold. Spirit might never fully recover. He might never be tame. He might leave one day, chasing some wild instinct she couldn't understand. But for now, he was here, alive, breathing, fighting, and that was enough. The chill of early spring slowly gave way to warmer breezes, and the fields around the Harper Ranch began to soften under the sun's steady gaze. Snowmelt trickled through the hills and soaked into the pastures, awakening the earth after its long winter slumber. Inside the kitchen, a different kind of awakening was underway. Spirit was standing on his own now, his legs still unsure, but stronger each day. The worst of the danger had passed, though Emily knew from experience that recovery wasn't a straight road. Some mornings, Spirit would spring up with energy, nipping at her bootlaces or stumbling toward the door in bursts of curiosity. Other mornings, he'd lie still for hours, as though remembering pain or fearing the world outside his blankets. Emily had moved him from the kitchen to a converted tack room in the barn, lining the stall with old quilts and hay. It wasn't much, but it was clean, quiet, and warm. She spent hours in that stall, brushing him, massaging his healing muscles, and talking about anything to fill the silence. Sometimes she read aloud from books left behind by her mother. Other times she sat quietly, just watching him sleep. Spirit had started to seek her out now, his head turning at the sound of her footsteps. He recognized the rhythm of her boots, the scent of her flannel shirts, the softness of her voice. When she approached with a bottle or water pail, his ears perked. When she sat nearby, he'd inch closer, his muzzle nudging her knee or her hand. It was trust, slow, fragile, and hard-earned. Lucas became a regular visitor during those weeks. Though words between them were still few, his actions spoke volumes. He brought bales of alfalfa, a new halter, and once, a toolbox with rusted hinges that held old veterinary supplies their father had used long ago. He even repaired a broken hinge on the stall door without being asked. Spirit took to Lucas cautiously, keeping his distance at first. But Lucas, always patient, never forced it. He'd sit in the straw with a carrot in hand, waiting. By the third week, Spirit took it gently from his palm and nudged him for another. The ranch began to feel alive again, filled with sounds that hadn't echoed through its bones in years. The soft thump of hooves on wood, the creak of the barn door swinging in the wind, Emily's quiet laughter as Spirit stole a rag from her back pocket and ran off like a mischievous pup. Even the dogs, who once barked and circled the foal with suspicion, had accepted him as one of their own, occasionally curling near his stall during cold nights. Healing was happening, not just to Spirit, but to Emily too. She found herself lingering outside longer, watching the horizon like she used to. She brewed coffee again, real coffee, not the instant kind she'd relied on through the worst of it. Her garden began to take shape, not because she needed the vegetables, but because she missed the rhythm of planting, the hope that came with it. One afternoon, while cleaning Spirit's stall, Emily paused to watch him play. He'd discovered the joy of knocking over a metal bucket, sending it clanging across the barn floor, then chasing after it with wide eyes and flailing limbs. Each time, he seemed surprised by the noise, but delighted nonetheless. It was the kind of unguarded joy only the young and the wild could feel. She leaned against the stall post, arms crossed, heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time, the ranch didn't feel like a weight on her back. It felt like home again. There were setbacks, of course. Spirit caught a chill during a sudden cold snap and had to be wrapped in blankets for 2 days straight. His back leg, still weak from the injury, caused him to stumble when he tried to run too fast. Emily kept detailed notes in a spiral notebook. Times of feedings, weight estimates, how much he drank, what foods he favored. The vet in town, impressed by the progress, offered to waive his fee for future checkups, simply saying, "I've never seen anything like it." But perhaps the biggest change wasn't in Spirit's health. It was in Emily's heart. Late one evening, long after the sky had turned purple and the stars began to scatter across the heavens, Emily stood outside the barn door. Spirit lay curled in his straw bed, tail flicking softly, his body rising with slow, peaceful breaths. Emily didn't go in. She simply watched from the doorway, arms folded across her chest. The memories came back again. The fire, the sirens, the smoke-stained faces, the silence that followed for weeks, the paperwork, the debt, the grief. How she'd stood in this very yard, wondering if she had the strength to keep the ranch alive. She hadn't realized until now how much she needed something, someone to believe in again. Spirit stirred, his eyes flickering open. He saw her and didn't move, only blinked, then laid his head back down and exhaled softly. Emily smiled. Healing didn't happen all at once. It came in layers, some so small they almost went unnoticed. A glance, a step, a heartbeat that didn't race with fear. The wild foal was learning to trust, and so was she. The Wyoming sky opened wide above the Harper Ranch, painted with streaks of blue and gold as spring gave way to early summer. The grass grew taller, greener, thick with life. Birds returned to nest beneath the eaves of the barn, and the breeze carried the scent of warm soil and wild sage. In that season of renewal, Spirit was thriving. His body had filled out, the angles of his ribs fading beneath a layer of lean muscle. His dappled gray coat gleamed in the sun, and the once fragile foal now ran across the paddock with a kind of reckless energy that made Emily hold her breath. Each stride seemed to stretch farther than the last. Hooves kicking up dust as he bucked and spun, tail lifted like a banner in the wind. There was something electric in his movements, beautiful, untamed, and entirely his own. Emily had seen horses run before, but Spirit didn't just run, he soared. But with strength came the stirrings of something deeper, an instinct Emily couldn't ignore. He no longer followed her the way he once had. He hesitated when called. His ears twitched at distant sounds in the hills beyond the ranch. At night, instead of curling in his stall, he paced restlessly, watching the stars through the slats of the barn walls. It was clear. Spirit was growing wild again. One afternoon, after turning him loose in the pasture, Emily watched as he stood at the far fence line for nearly an hour, ears alert, gaze fixed toward the open plains. When she called for him, he didn't move. Not out of defiance, but from something older, deeper, an ancestral pull she could never hope to compete with. And then came the day he escaped. It happened quickly, without warning. The latch on the gate had come loose in the wind, and Spirit, driven by some invisible force, seized the moment. By the time Emily heard the distant thunder of hooves, he was already a blur on the horizon, his body slicing through the tall grass, mane flying, hooves barely touching the ground. Emily grabbed a rope and leapt into the saddle before she could think. Penny responded to the urgency, galloping after the trail Spirit had carved through the fields. The chase took them beyond the familiar hills, into the wild stretches of prairie where fences gave way to freedom, and the land rolled out like a sea of gold. She spotted him far ahead, darting between ridges, untouchable. Emily called his name again and again, but he didn't stop. Not until, at last, he reached a bluff overlooking a dry creek bed and turned back. Their eyes met across the distance. In that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, sorrow, maybe even apology. Then Spirit snorted, pawed at the ground, and lowered his head. He didn't run again, but he didn't come closer either. Emily dismounted slowly, letting the rope drop from her hands. Her breath came in short bursts, not just from the ride, but from the realization sinking in. Spirit wasn't meant for fences. Not really. No matter how much time they'd shared, how much healing had passed between them, he wasn't hers to keep. She stayed like that for a long time, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, she approached carefully, offering nothing more than her presence. Spirit let her stroke his neck. His skin was damp with sweat, his flanks still quivering from the run, but his eyes were calm. That night, she couldn't sleep. Sitting alone on the porch, Emily replayed the day over and over. She thought about the look in Spirit's eyes on that bluff, the way the wind tugged at his mane, how he stood so still yet seemed ready to vanish into the horizon. It wasn't rebellion, it was instinct. Nature whispering in his blood, calling him back to the wild. The next morning, she drove into town. The wildlife sanctuary sat 2 counties away, nestled between protected hills where herds of Mustangs roamed free under careful management. Emily had only visited once, years ago, on a school field trip. Back then, it felt like a place for other people's horses. Now, it felt like something she needed to understand. The sanctuary manager, a woman named Dana, listened as Emily described Spirit's journey, from the brambles to the kitchen floor, from near death to full gallop. When Emily hesitated, unsure how to phrase her question, Dana filled the silence. "Some of them need to run," she said. "Not because they're trying to leave us behind, but because that's who they are. If he's ready, we can help." Emily drove home with the windows down, letting the wind carry away her thoughts. Back at the ranch, Spirit met her at the gate, nuzzling her hand like he always had. But now she saw the signs more clearly, the restless shifting, the way his ears turned toward the distant hills, listening for something only he could hear. The hardest part of love, she realized, wasn't holding on. It was knowing when to let go. The morning of Spirit's departure arrived with a heaviness that clung to everything: the air, the sky, and most of all, Emily's chest. The wind was still, unusually quiet for late summer, as if the land itself understood what was about to happen. Emily had spent the night in the barn, lying beside Spirit in his stall with one arm draped across his neck. She hadn't meant to sleep, but sometime between midnight and dawn, her eyes closed and the rhythm of his breathing lulled her into fragile rest. When she awoke, pale light filtered through the cracks in the wood, and Spirit was already standing, watching her in silence. Outside, the trailer was parked at the edge of the driveway. Dana from the sanctuary had arrived just after sunrise, bringing a wide, padded trailer designed for Mustangs. It was painted white and bore the marks of long road travel, dust, mud, and sun-faded stickers from distant ranches. Spirit sniffed it curiously when Emily led him to it earlier, but hadn't tried to step inside. Now, as the hour approached, Emily moved slowly through her final preparations. She brushed Spirit's coat one last time, her strokes deliberate, lingering. She cleaned his hooves, checked the bandage on his leg, and smoothed the red bandana she had tied around his neck. It was faded now, the corners frayed, but it had once belonged to her father. It had seen cattle drives, fires, floods, and funerals. Now, it would go with Spirit as a piece of home. Lucas arrived without needing to be asked, parking his truck by the barn and stepping out with quiet purpose. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Emily handed him a rope halter, and he nodded. They worked in unspoken coordination, preparing Spirit gently, patiently. Word had spread. A few neighbors gathered by the fence, not out of nosiness, but respect. Old Mr. Reed from down the road, Marcy from the feed store. Even Clint showed up, leaning against his truck, hat in hand. As the sun rose higher, Spirit stepped into the center of the yard, ears flicking, his body alert but calm. Emily took the lead rope in her hand, walking beside him toward the trailer. Each step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the ramp, Spirit hesitated. He sniffed the edge, pawed once, then backed away. Emily didn't pull. She let the rope hang loose, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He turned his head toward her, eyes dark and wide. For a moment she thought he wouldn't go, that he would turn and bolt back to the pasture, that maybe, just maybe, this was all a mistake. But then slowly, Spirit stepped forward. One hoof, then another, then all four, his body settling into the trailer's padded interior. He turned once inside, facing Emily at the open door, She reached up and stroked his muzzle, her voice too thick with emotion to speak. Her fingers found the bandana at his neck, tugging it slightly to sit straight. A final gesture of care. Dana closed the trailer door gently, securing the latches. The sound of metal on metal rang out louder than it should have. Emily stepped back. As the trailer pulled away, Spirit's shadow disappeared behind the tinted windows. The crowd began to disperse, some offering kind words, others just a nod of understanding. Emily didn't move until the dust from the tires settled and the horizon grew still again. The silence afterward was immense. Back inside the house, everything felt hollow. The kitchen was too clean, the barn too quiet. The space in her life that Spirit had filled now echoed with absence. She sat on the porch for hours that afternoon, her thoughts drifting like the wind. She remembered the first night she found him, how small and broken he had looked in the brambles, how hopeless the odds had seemed, how hard she'd fought, not just for his survival, but for her own healing. Spirit had been more than a rescue. He had been a reason. Now he was gone. Not lost, but gone. That night, she didn't light a fire in the barn. She didn't leave the porch light on. She simply sat under the stars and let the grief roll over her in waves. It wasn't like losing a pet or a possession. It was something more ancient, more profound. A piece of her soul had galloped away down that dirt road, carried in the heart of a wild Mustang she had once saved. But beneath the sorrow was something else, something quieter, stronger. Pride. Spirit had made it. He was healthy, whole, and now he had a future that stretched far beyond fences and stalls. He would run with his own kind, his hooves carving stories into the land. He would grow into something bold and fearless, shaped by the wild that had always lived inside him, and he would remember her. Emily believed that with every part of herself, not because she wanted to, but because she knew. The bond they had forged was not something distance could erase. As she finally stood and turned toward the house, her steps were slow but steady. She had let him go, and in doing so, she had found herself again. The trailer doors swung open slowly as Spirit stepped into his new world. The Mustang sanctuary sat beneath a vast blue sky framed by rugged hills, its pastures stretching far beyond what Spirit had ever seen. Wind swept through the grasslands in waves, stirring his mane and filling his lungs with scents that were wild and unfamiliar. Sagebrush, dust, and the faint trace of other horses. Dana led him gently into a holding paddock where he could acclimate before being introduced to the larger herd. Spirit moved cautiously at first, hooves tapping the packed dirt, ears flicking to every new sound. The whinny of a nearby mare, the low call of a stallion across the fence line, the distant rustle of wildlife in the brush. He wasn't afraid. He was alert. For the first few days, Spirit kept his distance from the others. He watched as bands of Mustangs came and went beyond the paddock gate, groups that formed and reformed with unspoken rhythms. Some were scarred, others sleek and proud. They galloped, bucked, and bathed in the dust, as if painting themselves with freedom. Spirit stayed still, silent, learning from afar. But instinct doesn't sleep. On the fourth day, Spirit began to call back, soft at first, then louder. He paced the fence line. His muscles twitched with restlessness. And when the gate finally opened, he didn't hesitate. He ran. Not with panic, not with aimless energy, but with purpose. Into the open range he bolted, flanked by the cries of the herd. He chased the wind, leapt over shallow ravines, and kicked up trails of dust that shimmered in the sun. The wild remembered him, and he remembered it. Emily watched it all from a distance. She visited on Saturdays, always quiet, always alone. She never stepped past the visitor fence, respecting the boundary between what was and what had become. The sanctuary had a raised platform near the southeast corner where guests could observe the herds. That's where Emily stood, eyes scanning the open plains, always waiting for one dappled gray among the rest. Some days she saw him immediately, other days not at all, but she always stayed for hours. One weekend, she brought a pair of binoculars and caught sight of Spirit nuzzling a young filly, her coat dark and glossy. They moved in tight circles, mirroring each other's steps. It was a quiet courtship, wild and ancient. Emily lowered the binoculars, a small smile on her lips. Spirit was finding his place, but wildness came with danger too. A month after Spirit joined the herd, a thunderstorm rolled in from the west, fierce and sudden. The sanctuary's open design meant the horses had room to escape, but it also left them exposed when the winds turned violent. That night, lightning lit the horizon, and rain fell in sheets so thick it washed through dry creeks and turned them into rivers. Dana and her team scrambled to account for every band. The creek along the northern boundary overflowed, trapping several Mustangs between rising waters and a narrow gorge. The terrain was rough, slick with mud, and visibility was low. No one could reach them safely. But the horses found their own answer. By morning, when the rain slowed and the sun began to burn through the clouds, a worker spotted the band on the far ridge, mud-caked and weary, but safe. They had made it to higher ground. Among them stood Spirit, his coat slick with rain, his chest heaving. He had led them through the flood. Dana recounted the event in her monthly sanctuary bulletin, naming Spirit as a rising leader, intuitive, strong, and brave. She sent a copy of the newsletter to Emily with a photo clipped to the top. In it, Spirit stood on a rocky ledge, the wind pulling at his mane. Eyes focused far into the distance. Emily held the paper in trembling hands. She traced his silhouette with her fingers, heart swelling with pride and something deeper, something wordless. Her Mustang was no longer a fragile foal hidden in brambles. He was a survivor, a leader, a creature of the wild who had earned his place. Back at the ranch, things were changing too. Emily had started mentoring a group of young riders from the nearby town, teaching them horsemanship and care. She'd reopened the old training ring, repaired the fences, and adopted 2 retired quarter horses for lessons. The laughter of children echoed across the pasture again, and the barn once filled with silence now hummed with life. Still, nothing filled the space Spirit had left. His old stall remained untouched. The red bandana that once hung around his neck now draped over the door like a silent memory. Sometimes, during the quiet hours just after sunset, Emily would sit by the fence and look west toward the horizon, wondering what he was doing, whether he remembered her, whether he still dreamed of the firelit kitchen, the scent of warm milk, and the girl who once sang to him through sleepless nights. But she didn't dwell in sorrow. Spirit was where he was meant to be, and so was she. The seasons turned, as they always did on the Wyoming plains, hot summers bending into gold-lit autumns, then swept aside by hard winters that made the land crack and shiver. The passage of time settled over the Harper Ranch like dust, quiet but steady. Spirit had been gone for years now, yet his presence lingered like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Emily never stopped thinking about him. She kept herself busy, pouring her energy into the lives of others. The writing program she started for local youth had grown beyond anything she imagined. Children from the town and nearby reservations came weekly to learn not just how to ride, but how to care, how to listen. She taught them patience with the animals, confidence in the saddle, and respect for the land. In their eyes, she saw glimpses of herself years ago. Young, determined, but guarded by grief. The ranch was no longer quiet. Laughter returned. Mornings were spent mucking stalls, brushing manes, and teaching nervous hands how to trust. Evenings brought warm meals, tired muscles, and the kind of exhaustion that came from purpose, not loneliness. Yet some nights, when the stars blanketed the sky and the barn lights dimmed, Emily still wandered out to Spirit's old stall. She hadn't let another horse use it. The red bandana remained looped over the door, unmoved. Dust collected around it, but she never wiped it away. It was part of the story now. Letters from the sanctuary came every few months. Short updates, sometimes with photographs. Spirit had grown into a stunning stallion, tall and strong with a presence that couldn't be ignored. He led his own band now, a small group that followed him with instinctive trust. Dana often included stories of how Spirit would guide others to water or shield the young during storms. One letter spoke of him chasing off a predator, keeping the herd safe without hesitation. Emily read every word with a tight throat, eyes lingering longest on the photos. Though his body had changed, matured, there was something unmistakable in his eyes. That same wild fire, that same soul. Then one crisp October morning, a new letter arrived, this time sealed with a silver emblem and printed on thick parchment. It wasn't from Dana, it was from the sanctuary's board. Inside was an invitation. They were hosting a special event to honor Spirit, recognizing him for his leadership and resilience. He was to be the face of a new educational campaign, one that would teach visitors about Mustangs, their history, and their place in the American West. The ceremony would be open to donors, guests, and community partners, but Emily's invitation came with a handwritten note. We know what Spirit means to us, but we also know he began with you. We hope you'll come. She read the message twice before setting it down. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the old tin box tucked beneath the kitchen cabinet, the one where she kept things that mattered. Letters. A broken buckle from her father's saddle, Spirit's first halter. Emily hadn't been back to the sanctuary in over a year, not because she didn't care, but because part of her believed Spirit needed that distance. That to truly become who he was meant to be, he had to let go of the girl who saved him. But now, they were asking her to return, not to take something back, but to bear witness. The day of the event, Emily dressed in worn denim and a faded flannel shirt. She pinned her hair back like she used to, pulled on her boots, and tucked the red bandana into her coat pocket. The drive took hours, but the sky stayed clear and the wind steady. As she passed familiar hills and riverbeds, memories rushed forward, the feel of Spirit's ribs beneath her hands, the heat of his breath on her neck, the weight of his head resting against her lap in the kitchen's firelight. The sanctuary was bustling with people when she arrived. Tents were set up along the welcome trail, decorated with photos of Mustangs and banners that read, "Honor the Wild." Children ran through obstacle courses shaped like horse trails, and speakers gave talks about ecology and history. But Emily didn't linger. She made her way to the overlook, the same one she'd visited all those years ago. The valley below teemed with movement. Horses grazed, galloped, mingled in shifting groups. But there, at the edge of the herd, stood one figure alone, larger, still, watching, spirit. Even from a distance, she knew. His coat shimmered in the light, a blend of storm cloud gray and silver. He turned his head slowly, scanning the crowd, and when his eyes reached her, something passed between them that time hadn't touched. Emily's breath caught. He didn't move immediately. But then, with the slow power of recognition, he began to walk, then trot, then gallop, straight up the hill, straight toward her. Visitors stepped aside, startled by the sudden surge. Emily didn't flinch. Spirit stopped just feet away, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling like a wave. He stared at her, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Then, gently, he lowered his head to her chest, and everything else disappeared. Years had passed. Worlds had changed, but the bond remained, unbroken. The crowd fell silent. All along the ridge, cameras were raised, conversations paused, and every eye followed the stallion as he thundered up the hill toward the woman who had once saved his life. But Emily didn't notice any of it. The world around her blurred into background noise, fading into wind and sunlight as Spirit reached her. His body, powerful now and broad through the chest, slowed into a walk just before reaching her. Dust clung to his legs, his flanks damp from the run. His ears twitched forward, alert and searching, as if confirming what his heart already knew. Then he stepped close, pressed his nose to her chest, and stood there, still, steady, breathing her in. Emily placed both hands on either side of his face. Her touch was soft but unshaken, and she ran her fingers down the white streak that still traced his forehead, now almost hidden beneath a thicker, wilder mane. She whispered his name, not loud, just enough to remind herself he was real, that this moment wasn't something conjured by old memories and longing. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Spirit leaned closer, nuzzling her shoulder like he used to do as a foal when he was curled beside the wood stove. A low hum vibrated in his chest, and Emily felt the tension inside her begin to unravel, piece by piece. They stood that way for a long time, woman and Mustang, lost in a reunion that needed no explanation. Below the ridge, visitors began clapping, some teary-eyed, others stunned into silence. Dana stood nearby, a knowing expression softening her features. She didn't speak either. There was nothing to say. Everyone had witnessed something rare, a bond that had defied time, distance, and wildness itself. Eventually, Spirit stepped back. He didn't bolt or turn away. He circled her once, brushing past her side, then lifted his head and let out a single, low whinny that echoed across the plains. Several horses below looked up in response. The call wasn't just instinct, it was recognition. A moment shared not only with Emily, but with his herd. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She didn't cry often anymore, not even during goodbyes. But this wasn't goodbye. This was something else. A gift. A confirmation that the love and labor she had poured into Spirit's recovery all those years ago had not only saved him, but shaped him. The rest of the ceremony continued with speeches and stories, pictures taken for news articles and newsletters. Spirit, now standing in a small holding corral near the viewing area, remained calm, composed, but never far from Emily's gaze. He watched her as if anchoring himself to her presence. She watched him like she was seeing a dream walk on four hooves. A plaque was unveiled in his honor. It showed a relief sculpture of Spirit in mid-gallop, his mane trailing behind him, his head raised with pride. Below the sculpture, the words were simple: Spirit, a symbol of resilience, leadership, and the unbreakable bond between horse and human. As people filtered out, taking brochures and souvenirs, Emily stayed behind. She didn't approach Spirit's corral again. She didn't want to confuse him with longing. He had his place now, and she understood that. Instead, she stood quietly near the fence, the same way she had done for years on her visits. Only this time, her heart felt full instead of fractured. Spirit turned toward her one last time before being led back to the herd. He paused at the gate, tail flicking gently, as if waiting for something unseen. The sun caught the edge of the red bandana she'd tied to the corral post earlier that day, fluttering in the wind like a signal between them. Then he walked away, slowly, steadily, back into the open range. Emily didn't follow. She didn't need to. On the drive home, the roads looked the same as they always had, winding through hills of golden grass and scattered rock, framed by cottonwoods along dry creek beds. But something inside her had changed. The ache she'd carried for years, tucked beneath her work and buried in the routines of daily life, had finally lifted. She remembered how fragile he had been, the nights of feeding him by hand, the mornings of doubt, the hours spent wondering if he would make it through another day. And now here he was, a leader, a legend, a creature both entirely his own and forever a part of her. The ranch came into view just as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the fields. Chickens clucked near the barn. The kids had left a few riding poles out in the ring. A dog barked lazily from the porch, tail thumping against the wood. It was a normal evening, but to Emily, everything felt different. The weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying had finally eased. What she had done for Spirit had returned to her tenfold, not just in the way he had remembered her, but in how she had remembered herself. She parked the truck, stepped out, and looked out toward the open fields stretching behind her house. The wind picked up. It smelled of sage and dust, and somewhere deep in her bones, she swore she could still feel hooves against the earth. Autumn drifted into winter quietly that year. Frost clung to the grass before sunrise, and the horses at Emily's ranch began growing thick winter coats. The kids who came for riding lessons brought thermoses of hot chocolate, wrapped in too many layers, laughing as they tried to mount without tripping over their boots. Emily found comfort in the rhythm of it all, the way life moved forward with or without fanfare. But even as the days passed, part of her lingered back at the sanctuary. The image of Spirit on that ridge, galloping toward her after years apart, replayed in her mind like a dream she refused to wake from. She didn't expect to see him again. That moment had been enough. It had filled her with a peace she hadn't known she still needed. Still, there were times, quiet, windless hours in the evening, when she stood on the porch and stared out toward the hills. She would listen, not for anything specific, just the silence between sounds, that strange stillness the earth sometimes held, like waiting. Then came the storm. It struck suddenly, the way winter storms often did in Wyoming, no warning, no mercy. One minute the wind was rattling dry leaves along the fences, and the next, thick flakes fell in angry spirals, reducing the world to white and wind. Emily moved quickly to secure the barn, ushering the animals inside, stacking extra hay in every stall. Power flickered. The roads vanished under snow. That night, she barely slept. The wind howled against the walls, and the cold crept in under every door. Somewhere past midnight, a sharp noise broke through the storm. A sound different from the wind, different from the trees. It was urgent, distressed. A whinny. Emily sat up, heart pounding. For a moment she thought it was her mind playing tricks. Then she heard it again, closer this time, raw and real. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her coat, and ran outside into the swirling dark. The snow whipped her face as she stumbled toward the barn, the flashlight beam cutting through thick flurries. At first, she saw nothing but white. Then, just beyond the corral, a shape moved, large, shadowed, staggering. It couldn't be. But it was. Spirit. He stood trembling, his coat soaked, patches of ice clinging to his mane. His flanks rose and fell with labored breath, and a gash along his shoulder leaked blood, dark against his gray hide. His eyes were wild with exhaustion, but locked on her the moment she approached. Emily dropped the flashlight and ran to him. She didn't question how he got there, didn't ask what drove him through miles of wilderness and snow. She simply pressed her forehead against his and breathed his name like a prayer. With trembling urgency, she led him into the barn, guiding him into the same stall where he'd once fought for life as a foal. It was still untouched. She'd never let another horse use it. Blankets were pulled down, bandages found, water warmed on the stove. Spirit didn't fight. He let her clean the wound, his body sinking into the old straw bed like it remembered every thread. She worked through the night, hands moving on instinct, her mind catching up only in fragments. He had come back. By dawn, the storm broke. The light spilled across the land, revealing drifts of snow and broken branches, but inside the barn, all was calm. Spirit slept deeply, his chest rising in steady rhythm. Emily sat beside him, back against the stall wall, her fingers tangled in the red bandana still tied to the post nearby. She didn't cry. She simply watched him breathe. Later that day, after a hot shower and 2 cups of coffee, Emily called Dana at the sanctuary. The call dropped twice before connecting, but Dana's voice came through clear and shaken. "We've been looking for him since yesterday," she said. "He broke through the fence, left his herd." Emily said nothing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the stall. "I don't know what pulled him back," Dana continued, "but whatever it was, he made it." Yes, he did. The following days were slow and careful. Spirit regained strength, eating steadily, wounds healing under Emily's constant care. The cut on his shoulder wasn't deep, but it would scar. Another mark on a body that had never belonged to anything easy. Emily didn't press him to stay. She knew better than that. But something had changed. When the barn door opened, Spirit didn't bolt for the hills. He wandered the pasture, explored the familiar trails, but always returned. At night, he stood beneath her window. In the mornings, she often found him by the fence, watching the sunrise with a stillness that spoke volumes. He had made a choice. Whatever instinct once drove him away had brought him back again, not out of weakness, but of will. Emily didn't pretend to understand it. Love, she realized, didn't always need understanding. It only needed to be met. Winter melted slowly that year. The snow receded in patches across the Wyoming prairie, exposing damp soil and crushed grass beneath. Tiny blades of green began to push through, tentative but persistent. The world was waking up again, and so was something in Emily. She watched the thaw unfold from the porch most mornings, coffee in hand, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. And out in the pasture just beyond the barn, Spirit stood like a sentinel, his silhouette familiar now, his presence grounding. He had not returned to the sanctuary. Emily had given him every opportunity. She'd opened the gates, left the roads clear, spoken softly about choices and freedom. But Spirit never left. Instead, he found a rhythm between the wild and the domestic, a balance only he could maintain. He roamed the hills during the day, his hooves carving paths through snowmelt and sage. But when the sun dipped behind the western ridge, he came back, always, to the ranch. Sometimes he waited at the barn door, sometimes at the porch. Other times, she found him sleeping in his old stall, as if no time had passed since those fragile nights long ago. Their bond was no longer built on need or rescue. It had become something deeper, mutual, quiet, unbreakable. Emily's riding school flourished in the seasons that followed. Word spread about the woman with the Mustang who came back. Families from towns across the region sent their children to learn from her. Not just riding skills, but patience, empathy, strength. Parents stayed to hear the story. Volunteers helped fix fences and paint stalls. The ranch transformed from a quiet outpost to a living sanctuary of its own. But she never let anyone ride Spirit. He remained free, untouched by reins or saddle. He was a partner, not a possession. The children admired him from a distance, whispering stories about the wild stallion who'd once outrun a flood and crossed mountains in a snowstorm. Sometimes he'd approach the edge of the corral, curious, letting them feed him bits of carrot or gently touch his nose. And that was enough. One morning in early summer, Emily stood at the edge of the pasture as the sun broke across the hills in a burst of gold. Spirit trotted toward her from the creek, mane glinting in the light, his movements fluid and sure. He stopped beside her and nudged her side. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the red bandana, and gently tied it around his neck. Not as a collar, as a symbol, a thread between two lives, stitched together by chance and choice. That day, she began writing down their story. Not for fame, not for bookshelves, but for the kids who came to the ranch, for the people who asked how she found the strength to rebuild, for anyone who'd ever wondered if something broken could ever truly be whole again. She wrote about the storm, the brambles, the kitchen stall, about the hard nights and small victories, about the run across the plains, the letting go, and the return. The lessons Spirit had taught her echoed in every word. That love was not control. That freedom could coexist with loyalty. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was to keep your heart open, even when the world had given you every reason to shut it. As she wrote, Spirit would sometimes stand by the porch rail as if listening. The sun continued to rise and fall, and the hills changed color with each passing season. Wildflowers bloomed, calves were born, fences broke and were mended again. Life kept moving. But Emily never rushed it. She understood now that nothing lasting was built in haste. Late one evening, under a sky painted with lavender and fire, she stood beside Spirit on the high ridge behind the ranch. The land stretched for miles, endless and open. He lifted his head to the breeze, nostrils flaring, ears turning toward the distant sounds of coyotes and wind. He could go if he wanted. He always could. But he stayed. Side by side, they watched the last light fade, the stars blooming above them one by one. It was not the ending she had imagined when she first carried him out of the brambles. It was better. This was not a story of taming the wild. It was a story of trusting it, of healing through it, of letting it return, and being brave enough to welcome it home.